amount of, quite frankly, thankless work that goes into it a lot of the time. So a little bit about myself. I work for Mozilla, which is the company that produces the Firefox web browser and all manner of other software products to help users and developers go about doing better things in their daily lives. We also have a bunch of people at our company who do various bits of advocacy work, so fighting for protecting users' privacy on the web, fighting for net neutrality, and a bunch of other worthwhile causes. I myself am the content lead and team manager of the writers team who work on a big website called NBN Web Docs. Pretty much anybody who's a web developer will have heard of this, but for people who aren't web developers, it's a giant encyclopedia of information to teach you how to develop websites. People use it literally, web developers use it literally daily to do their work. They use it to look up syntax, because obviously when you're trying to remember a huge amount of technical code things, it's impossible to remember all that syntax. They use our site to look up things all the time, and there's beginners tutorials, there's all kinds of things. So most of my job involves reading really long, complicated specs that define how web technologies are supposed to work, working out how to actually use those in some kind of sane way, writing up the documentation so that web developers don't have to go through that same pain. I am a total accessibility whingebag, so by that I mean mainly around the accessibility of websites, making it so that websites can be used by people with disabilities and other sort of minority groups, things like people on mobile phones, people on slow network connections. I believe that there's a lot of really amazing stuff that we can do with the web these days, but for me, like, the coolest or sexiest aspect of the web is still the universal access aspect of it, and unfortunately people seem to forget that a lot in more recent times. And outside work, I'm a heavy metal drummer, so I listen to all sorts of atonal, horrible, noisy music. So, so first of all, I wasn't really sure how to pitch this talk, so I'm just beginning with a bit of a kind of an introduction to the World Wide Web and kind of where it came from, and some interesting aspects about it that kind of inform how I do my documentation work and my maintenance work. So, the internet was invented as part of the US military project called ARPANET in the late 60s. Fast forward 20 odd years, and this guy called Tim Berners-Lee, who I'm sure most of you will have heard of, whilst working as a research scientist at CERN, built a few technologies on top of the internet that allowed it to become the web, which is this amazing kind of educational, ubiquitous thing that we know today. Really, really nice bloke. I actually had breakfast with him once. It scared the hell out of me because I wasn't expecting anyone to come along. This guy just sat down and said, "Hey, might I join you for breakfast?" And it was Tim Berners-Lee, and I was like, biggest rock star moment I've ever had. I was just like a teenager, like weeping over their favourite pop star. But he was very nice about it. So, the interesting part about the web is it's an open platform, and so by that we mean that rather than closed platforms, in the case of a closed platform, you'll have a single company that will develop and can completely control a piece of technology and exactly how it's allowed to be used and published and distributed. Instead, the web is an open platform, so no one company controls any part of the technologies that you use to build websites or any of the infrastructure. So in a way, it's kind of the closest thing we have to a modern technological democracy. Any changes that you want to make to the technologies that make up the web platform, you have to have loads of big meetings in a room with lots of very scary, intelligent people and argue for days and days and days about a slight little change. But this design by committee can be quite painful, but it does mean that at the end of the day, we end up with this open resource which is built for the good of all the people in the world rather than just making loads of money for one specific company. There are a lot of companies that are really heavily trying to change that, but I'm not going to go on a big political bitch fest. I'm just going to keep to the subject in hand. So this is kind of good. It's as I say, it means that theoretically anyone with an internet connection and a computer is free to build and look at websites. There isn't any sort of hefty licensing fee. If you dare to open up a code editor and write an HTML page, you can do that for free and not be in fear of some kind of licensing police cracking down on you. It's literally licensed, so it's impossible to be controlled by one company when you're actually making changes and trying to publish a new technology specification for a web technology. There are all sorts of stipulations that say, you know, you're not allowed to include any submarine patents in that specification or anything. So there's all sorts of things that go into place to make sure that it just can't have anything there that means it can be controlled or monetized specifically by one company. So in the early days, when the web first came about, sort of early 90s we're talking, we had old browsers like, I'm sure you've all heard about the joys of Internet Explorer and attempting to make websites work in it. I'm sure you've heard one of your technical friends moan about that at some point. There was another browser called Netscape which competed with Internet Explorer and lost because Microsoft were much more aggressive and better at marketing than Netscape were. Out of the ashes of Netscape eventually came Firefox. There was this Norwegian browser company called Opera, whom I used to work for. In fact, that's their famous toilet seat logo at the bottom left there. And there was also a browser called KHTML, which was eventually forked to create the WebKit browser that you use on iOS or Apple products. And that itself was then forked to become Chromium, which is what powers the Google Chrome browser and a bunch of other clones of Google Chrome. So I've been talking about web standards, haven't I? But in the early days when the web first came about, there weren't really any standards. And, you know, there were theoretically standards. You know, browsers supported technologies like HTML and JavaScript that we use to build web pages these days. But back in the early days, companies had it in their minds that they were going to specifically build the web, specifically build their browser to have technologies that worked in deliberately competing different ways, because it sounded great because competition's good, right? But that was really crap and annoying to start off with, because you'd literally have to go, okay, I have to build a completely different version of my website for Netscape 4 as I do for Internet Explorer 4, and then you've got to use some horrible code to work out which browser it's trying to look at your website, then you've got to deliver them one page or the other page, and it was such a nightmare for web developers back in those days, and ultimately it also hurt the end users. And it just meant that the product was inferior. So, jumping forward a little bit, because of all this nonsense, Tim Berners-Lee and co. knew there was a bit of a problem, so they created this organisation called the W3C, or World Wide Web Consortium, which is now based at the MIT labs in Massachusetts. So the web really needed standardisation, and the W3C, it's basically the British Standards Institute for geeks. It's the institute that acts as custodian of all of these different standards documents that define these technologies. But the trouble was with this standards institution is that it was a little bit kind of nicey-nicey about these standards, and the technical term for these web standards specifications is actually recommendations. And it's kind of, we recommend that you do it like this rather than you have to, which meant that a lot of browsers just completely ignored them and carried on just doing proprietary stupid things that worked in competing different ways. It actually took a number of years and a lot of action by various pressure groups, for example the Web Standards Project, or WASP as it was called, and they used to basically just have lots of volunteer members, lots of community volunteer members going along and putting lots of pressure and bullying browser vendors until they actually started supporting the standards all in the same way. Eventually browsers became consistent-ish. I'm not going to go out there and say that stuff works the same across all browsers right now, because that will be a lie, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So there's various terms you'll hear, just to briefly coin some of those. So open source is content and code that you can contribute to and reuse, as opposed to closed source, which means that some company has the source code to this product and locks it away so that nobody can actually file a bug or have any part in fixing things on it. There's not really that much reason for any software to not be open source these days, I would argue, because it means that the whole community can see the source code and go, well, I found a bug there, I'm going to submit a patch to fix that bug, and then the core team can then look at it and decide if they want to include that fix and do it. So, that's just not possible with closed source. Open standards is technology definitions that can be openly implemented and contributed to, so it's basically open source philosophy brought to specifications and standards documents. And web standards is open standards specifically for web technologies. So you'll hear those terms quite a lot. I now want to change gears a bit and talk about my company, Mozilla, and the part that we play in helping with open standards and keeping the web going. So specifically the documentation part. So the reason why we need webs, we have all of these specifications that write out in excruciating detail how web technologies are supposed to work. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left. That's exciting. But they're really hard to read. They're not written for web developers to learn how to make websites from. They're written for implementers to implement those technologies in web browsers. So we started to document the web in about 2006. Our website is called MDN Web Docs, or MDN for short, and it contains all manner of references and technology tutorials and learning material and a bit of documentation about how Mozilla's internal technologies work, but not so much. And it's a complete pain to do. My job is just a nightmare of spreadsheets and conversations. I'm trying to keep track of a million things on post-it notes. My team has to do documentation on regular releases of Firefox. So every time a new release of Firefox comes out, we have to work out the sort of between 50 and about 200 different things the engineers have changed since the last version, and then go and document those in excruciating detail with, what difference is this for web developers, what changes have been made, what do people need to know about the new version. We have a bunch of larger roadmap pieces that we also look at, and various requests from the teams. That's what the site looks like. We have a lot of page views. The English pages alone, there's 21,000 pages and about 16 million page views a month. And then we have all of the locales to worry about. There's not many people that speak other languages on the core team, or not many other languages, so a lot of this stuff is done by community alone. This is what we have: 6 full-time writers, 2 part-time writers, and several thousand volunteers. And maintaining that community and keeping it healthy is a real challenge. The last talk was particularly interesting. A lot of the things that were said, I was like, yep, I know exactly how that feels. And I'm very, very careful in managing my team to check with them all the time that they're not experiencing burnout, because you've literally got community volunteers talking to you all the time. Half the time, you don't really get much work of your own done on the day. So roughly how the process of documenting a web technology works is: the spec is written, as I talked about. The technology at some point will land in a web browser. The web browser company will go, this piece of technology has got enough interest behind it, enough people want it, that we're actually going to implement it in the browser so that people can start using it to build features on their web pages. We have developer relations teams who are also called technical evangelists, which is a bit of a strange loaded term I've always thought, but they're literally responsible for going out, doing talks and getting people excited about using technologies. And once they sort of contribute to the task of getting people excited about these technologies, roughly around then is the time where we think, right, it's worth documenting this now, because more than one browser supports it and it's looking like people are getting interested in it. Sometimes you do it wrong and you'll document a huge technology and then you'll realise that they did it wrong and no one's interested in it and you'll just have to delete the pages, but normally we're fairly well informed. So I would argue that the role, so I'm getting to the last section now, I would argue that the role we play is vital for web developers. As I say, it's difficult to learn how to make websites at the best of times, but so you need good documentation. People use it every day to do their job, and we try and be as common and neutral and canonical as possible. It would be no good if it was just kind of, this is all heavily biased towards Mozilla and Firefox because there's other browsers out there, and it wouldn't be credible if we just sort of constantly had Firefox adverts everywhere. So we do try and make it as neutral as possible. I believe it's for the public good, because the web is such a ubiquitous public resource. We need to make sure that developers keep producing better websites that work on mobile devices and all of the other devices that have browsers on these days. Make sure that websites are made that are accessible for people with disabilities and all kinds of different groups of people. We're basically making it so it's easy to learn the web. And it's not just us either. Various other companies, such as Google, Microsoft, Samsung, etc., have had their own web technology documentation resources, but most of them have just given up and joined and started contributing to MDN instead, because it's kind of pointless trying to just compete when the documentation is for like a public resource anyway, so there's not really anything to gain from that. So we now have a bunch of people who work for those companies contributing to MDN as well, and we talk to all of these member companies once every 3 months and just listen to their needs and what they'd like to have as documentation priorities and things. So that's kind of good. I just kind of feel that it's important to keep the web alive. As I said before, about the only technological democracy or something close to that we've really got. And it does need tender loving care. There's a lot of companies out there that would like to see the web die, so they could just replace it with their own proprietary thing that would make them money instead. So we do fight to try and make sure that it gets kept good and kept going, and it keeps evolving to meet user needs going on. So that is pretty much it. Not sure what Eddie Vedder was doing there. I think that was my terrible joke about the weather live. I completely forgot that. So anyway, that is my talk. Thank you very much.